few months ago, I made a video detailing what I believe to be one of, if not the best comic book video games of an era, that being Marvel's Ultimate Alliance 1. You may remember it, as it has become the most popular video on my channel, and oh my gosh, look at those views. Thank you all for the feedback, for those of you who have seen that, and if you haven't seen that video yet, please go check that one out first, as I will not be restating a lot of information about the development cycle of these games. The feedback you left on that video really means a lot. It kind of inspired me to go through with making this a series, and yeah. Before we get into the video, I just wanted to say thank you and that I appreciate that very much. So, with that, without further ado, my name is Noah, and welcome to Panel Slam. If you missed out on my video on Ultimate Alliance 1, I said I believed it to be the best comic book video game of an era. This is due to the game's wide variety of cast of characters and exploration of the Marvel Universe in general. The game is far from perfect by any means, but there's a lot of content in there to enjoy. Ultimate Alliance was the first video game I ever played, and due to such it holds a very special place in my heart. I might have bias by saying it's one of the best of the era, but the memories I have of getting stuck in the Atlantis level, or flying around as Human Torch, don't get in the way of my thoughts on the quality of the game in general. Due to this, imagine the shock on little Noah's face when he was reading his stepdad's gaming magazine and saw a single-page advertisement of the sequel to the best game he had ever played. For the life of me, I can't find a picture of this ad, but I remember seeing so many cool characters lining up against each other. God, I miss gaming magazines so much. So there I was, sitting in shock, anticipating when this game would come out. I didn't have access to the internet at this time, so when that faithful Christmas morning came and I opened the clean copy of Marvel's Ultimate Alliance 2 on the Nintendo Wii, I went in blind and was greeted with this. Now, I know this is a nitpick, but this main menu is horrible. Sure, the original title screen consisted of reused cutscenes with Microsoft Word art over it, but at least that was more dynamic than this. You never even get a good frame where all the characters are in a shot because the stupid camera pans all over the place. This is like the start of a reoccurring trend 2 uses a lot throughout the game. The graphic design ranges from boring to just plain bad at times. This culminates in the character's select screen. Say what you want about the original, but one of the best locations in that game was the character's select screen. All the heroes were lined up, 3D models and all, in an underground shield base ready to rock at a moment's notice. It's a very good design. You can see a large portion of the characters as you cycle through them. Even the unlockable ones are heavily obscured by the darkness, while not contrasting with the already visual characters. Now back to this thing. All of the heroes are just piled up with no rhyme or reason. Even the 3D models are gone, now replaced with 2D illustrations. Yeah, sure, the art's good, but something doesn't feel right about them. It gets worse from here, though, because when you try choosing a character, you get this awful wheel thing, where you have to scroll through all these images 3 at a time to get the character you want. Perhaps the greatest offense of all, however, are the gaping black silhouettes that serve as indicators that you still have characters to unlock. Sure, 1 did the same thing, but the silhouettes barely contrasted with the black background. In this game, the giant black blobs of flesh are in the middle of the pile of illustrations. This just looks horrible, especially considering the white background forces them to stick out like a sore thumb. While we're at this first grader playing with Microsoft Paint excuse for graphic design, I suppose we should discuss the characters that you may or may not be able to see depending on how good your vision is. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 is a pretty decent roster overall. A lot of the characters from 1 returned with a few exceptions, while adding popular exclusions that were absent in 1. The returning characters go as follows: Captain America, Iron Man, Wolverine, Spider-Man, Hulk, Thor, Cyclops, Storm, Black Panther, Daredevil, Iceman, Deadpool, Miss Marvel, Luke Cage, Mr. Fantastic, Invisible Woman, Thing, Human Torch, Blade, and Magneto. The game's new characters consist of fan favorites who weren't in the last game. We get Jean Grey, Gambit, Psylocke, Juggernaut, and Cable from the X-Men, Carnage, Mac Gargan, Venom, and Green Goblin as villain characters, and Penance and Songbird as the more niche picks. Similarly to its predecessor, Ultimate Alliance 2 also had several characters that were version exclusives. In this case, the DS versions of the game got access to She-Hulk and Sentry, and the later re-releases of the game got Iron Fist. Overall, this is a really nice roster in my opinion. She-Hulk and Sentry being excluded from the base game is a bit aggravating, but other than that, it's not that big of a deal. Having said that, some of the game's costume design is questionable at best, looking at you, Nick Fury. Speaking of the costumes, this game only has 2 per character. I gotta say, when you cut the amount of costumes each character has, you should probably make sure they look good instead of something like this. Yeah, a lot of this game's design choices, ranging from the costumes to the UI, just don't look that good. Like, what the hell is up with Deadpool's alternate costume? I've been reading comics all my life, and I don't recognize this from anywhere. Going even further into the characters, each character no longer has a wide variety of interchangeable powers because Activision opted only to give each character 4. While I do believe that this is a change for the worse, I don't think that it's a horrible idea, from a design aspect at least. By giving each character fewer special moves, it gives the devs room to work on each character feeling and playing different. The equipment system also gets worse. The game decides to give you these medals you find from doing side quests that no one ever does, that apply universal perks to your entire team rather than just a singular character it's been assigned to. Once again, this is a good idea on paper, but I just don't know a single person who's played this game that pays any attention to these medals. The equipment in Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1 was fun because it consisted of items belonging to iconic heroes and villains. But then again, what's really more iconic here? The bionic arm of the Winter Soldier or plus 100 body damage medal? Now, I'm totally willing to admit that I might be acting a little too harsh on this game. However, I'm only doing so because the first game had a lot of great aspects that 2 fails to follow up on. The characters have less customization, which was my favorite aspect of its predecessor. The game's character models and locations all look great, but some design choices are just horrible. This is pretty much the opposite of my views on 1. The character models, while not anything amazing, had really appealing costume design. And honestly, despite what it might seem like, I really do like the game's graphics. They're a huge step up from the polygonal styling of 1 while maintaining the gritty aesthetic that I love so much. There's a few improvements in 2. Wolverine's default costume is his actual Wolverine costume rather than his street clothes, and the costumes of the cast are more focused on their Earth-616 appearances rather than the weird mix of Ultimates and 616 costumes. Despite what I've said so far, I don't want to give you the wrong idea. Ultimate Alliance 2 is far from a terrible game. Sure, I may like the original more in some aspects, but things start to change when we get to the gameplay and, holy crap, this is some of the best action gameplay I've seen in a long time. So yeah, let's address the elephant in the room here. While Marvel's Ultimate Alliance 1 featured individual super moves for each character, 2 does what 9-year-old me thought was the coolest thing since Iceman by introducing fusion moves. These attacks combine the powers of 2 heroes on your team to perform a super move that can be powered up by mashing a button. These fusion attacks range from Green Goblin throwing pumpkin bombs to a rock that the Thing throws at you, or Luke Cage and Captain America running and smashing anything they make contact with, even the iconic fastball special where Hulk picks up Wolverine and throws him into a crowd of enemies. Outside of that, the gameplay remains about the same as the first, with each character having access to both light and heavy attacks, with the ability to create combo strings that stun, topple, or launch an enemy. As mentioned earlier, each character only has access to 4 powers each, in opposed to the several different powers available in the previous installment. Very few of these are powers or support moves, creating a game that just boils down to using characters that output the most damage. I say that, but that's what most people did when playing through 1 anyway, so it's not the biggest difference. The only other major change to the gameplay is that you can now heal a dead teammate without having to wait 5 minutes to do so. The game gives you these healing tokens that you get after dealing a set amount of damage with the fusion moves, and you can use these to either heal your party or revive a fallen teammate. All the characters play differently enough from one another that the game offers tons of replayability through its campaign using different characters, which works in the game's favor, seeing as how the campaign is the only game mode most players will bother to play. Unfortunately, Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 chooses to cut the comic book missions introduced by its predecessor, replacing them with battle simulations, which are just challenge maps that ask you to defeat a certain amount of enemies or reach a goal within a certain time period. If you do well in these, you get gear, but that's about it. In the original, not only did the comic book missions introduce you to who each of these characters in the game were, but it also incentivized the players to play these missions because doing so would give them a costume. 2 simulator missions only give you gear, with the exclusion of the Wii version of the game, which gives you access to play as Cyclops, Jean Grey, and other certain unlockable characters. This leaves the exposition of each hero to be left in the audio recordings, which most players won't even listen to, myself included. Speaking of things that most players won't give a damn about, let's talk about the game's story. Now, I'm mostly kidding when I say that, but compared to the story of Ultimate Alliance 1, 2's campaign is just a lot less impressive. Instead of developing another entirely new story, Activision opted to adapt the recently written Civil War storyline instead, making a few changes along the way. So let's break it down. How does Ultimate Alliance 2's story compare to that of the original? The story starts with Nick Fury and his team performing an assault on Latveria, the home of Doctor Doom. They have a lead on a scientist who's been developing new weapons for supervillains who rely on supersuits or gadgets for their powers, such as Electro or the Wizard. They succeed in this attack with the new head of Latveria being presumed dead. We then see a 1-year time skip until we see the return of a cybernetic version of the Baroness of Latveria, Lucia von Bardis, who has begun an attack on New York City. This attack is foiled by Miss Marvel, but several city blocks are destroyed in the process. Due to this, the government proposes the Superhero Registration Acts. These would reform American superheroes into a sort of superpowered police force, where superheroes have to have badges to operate. Now, I'm sure most of you watching this have probably heard the Civil War storyline, but from this point, it's about the same. However, I'm going to go over it a little bit just for those who don't know that much about it. These acts drive a wedge in the superhero community between Iron Man and his party of those who support the acts, and Captain America with his followers believing the acts to go against what a superhero should be. This culminates in the acts being passed and Captain America's resistance going underground, waging guerrilla warfare on vital shield points as a way to combat these acts. While most of the time I prefer an original story, in opposed to a retelling of a pre-existing one, Ultimate Alliance 2 changes a lot about the Civil War storyline going forward that makes it a very interesting adaptation in my eyes. If you don't know that much about the original Civil War story, I'll run through it here as the story takes up a good 2/3 of the game. Captain America continues to resist the Axe, eventually culminating in several battles where the Resistance is forced to clash with the shield-backed superheroes. The game does a good job of incorporating this into its gameplay, as certain characters can only be played in certain routes of the story. The player gets to choose whether they side with Captain America, the right choice, or Iron Man, who is an absolute asshole in this. Depending on who they chose, the player will only be able to play as the characters who chose the side of the characters that they chose to side with in the comic. This presents an interesting choice to the players. They're able to experience 2 separate sides of the same story. Or that's what the box says, at least. In actuality, regardless of which version of the story you play, you'll be playing the exact same maps with minimal changes. Which is a real shame, because the boss fights in this game are one improvement 2 holds over its predecessor. My personal favorite is the fight against Giant Man, or Goliath, where you have to go toe-to-toe with a towering figure. It plays similarly to the Galactus fight in 1, but something about it just feels more fluid in my opinion. So yeah, the story is essentially the same, regardless of whether side you pick, and the split is only temporary. Due to that, I'll only be covering the game's overall story, and opposed to delving into all the differences between both sides. If you choose Captain America, your missions consist of destroying shield bases and preventing attacks from the Initiative, who are the heroes that sided with the Registration Acts. Iron Man's missions are the exact same thing, except the bases you destroy belong to the Resistance instead of SHIELD. These missions fill up a large portion of the game's midpoint and culminate into some really major battles of note. The first is the assault on the Stark chemical plant. I love this map because it's essentially a boss rush against other superheroes. This game has significantly less bosses than the original, which isn't saying much, as the original would stuff 5 to 7 bosses in a single map, but having a level that's stuffed with these characters is a neat callback to the original. It's a fun level for sure, with lots of fun bosses, which is a trend the game unfortunately does not follow. We'll get into that later. So after this battle, the Alliance gets caught up in the crossfire between Iron Man and Old Cappy and are assumed to have been killed in the battle. This is not true, however, as the team is saved by none other than Nick Fury, who is presumed to be dead at this point. To sidetrack for a second, if I had a nickel for every story I've read that involved Nick Fury being killed, I could buy out Marvel. I mean, seriously, this guy has come back from the dead more times than Jean Grey, the character whose whole gimmick is that she rises from the dead. She's called the Phoenix for a reason. Jokes aside, though, Nick Fury serves as the exposition dump that introduces the original aspects of the game's plot. Up to this point, the story's pretty much just been a copy-paste of its comic book counterpart. But the game shakes this up by introducing a new threat, that being the nanites used to force supervillains to act as soldiers for S.H.I.E.L.'s superhuman army in the Civil War. These nanites have been altered by a new villain in the shadows known only as the Fold. At this moment, we know very little about the Fold, but Nick Fury infers that they're led by Baron von Bardas, Dr. Doom's successor that the Alliance faced in the opening of the game. Fury knows that somehow the Fold is able to control the nanite injected, so he devises an elaborate plan that will allow the Alliance to obtain a fresh sample of nanites, which will be used to develop a cure. The plan sees the team sneak into the Negative Zone, a prison in another dimension that holds prisoners of war. Civil War, huh? But yeah, it's essentially just Marvel's version of the Phantom Zone. So the team gets the sample, but while they're there, Captain America launches a prison break, starting a battle between both sides, and this battle is interrupted by the nanite-infested villains. This results in the portal back home being at risk of closing, and the heroes have to rush to defend it from all the raging supervillains. So, you know how earlier I mentioned that this game has a problem with boss fights? Well, this chapter really brings that issue to focus. Throughout the game, there's a handful of reoccurring villains you fight. These include Molten Man, Diamondback, Grim Reaper, Whirlwind, Shocker, just to name a few. You fight these people multiple times throughout the game, and they get boring very fast. In the Negative Zone chapter, you fight all of them back to back to back, despite having only faced them a few levels earlier, and then you fight them all again at the end of the level. I wouldn't normally see this as a problem, but the game is really lacking in villain bosses, with there only being a handful early on in the game's story that are just reused later down the line. And yeah, the boss fights in 1 weren't perfect, but those existed more as a means of including several villains across the Marvel Universe. Anyways, the nanite-infected villains are defeated, and both Iron Man and Captain America's teams retreat through the portal. They settle their differences, once again reassembling the Avengers as a whole, and not a moment too late either, as not only has Nick Fury gone missing at this point, but all the nanite-infected villains have broken loose, and the team's attempts to stop the nanite infection have all failed. It is now being spread worldwide, and the team is forced to meet up in Wakanda. Here they meet the now-cured Green Goblin and Venom, who both agree to help the Alliance take down the Fold, and now they try to take down Nick Fury himself. In a last resort, the heroes decide to take the fight to the Fold by infiltrating a radio base where they plan to broadcast a radio signal that will paralyze anyone infected with the nanite virus. This would allow them to be paralyzed long enough for a cure to be distributed. As they make their way up the tower, the team learns that the one behind the Fold was none other than the Tinkerer, and shortly after learning this, a new Nick Fury shows up, and oh my god, he looks ugly. Listen, I know he has to have a cool final boss design, but couldn't they just have him look like a regular human? I mean, none of the other nanite-infected guys look this bad. So yeah, the heroes beat Nick Fury, and all the superheroes are cured. The ending varies depending on whichever side you picked, with the Superhero Registration Act either being passed or turned down, and with that, the credits roll. So how does Ultimate Alliance 2 hold up compared to its predecessor? Well, it's complicated. There are several aspects about 2 that I like, but there's also several issues I have with this game. In my opinion, the roster, character, and UI design and story in 1 are superior to that of 2. However, 2's gameplay and graphics are better. With that being said, what do I think is the better game? For that question, I'd have to go with the original. While both games are very good in their own right, I feel that both the characters and extra content in the original vastly outweigh the good things about 2. Having said that, Ultimate Alliance 2 is by no means a bad game. In fact, it's still a really good game that I would recommend to any comic book fan or gamer in general. And hey, it's not even the worst in the franchise.